Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to our National Coming Out Day event. Happy to have you. Happy National Coming Out Day to everybody here. I am thrilled to have with us a speaker who is very important to me, and certainly you know, my career, so I want to introduce him. We will be taking attendance in this, and we will send out an attendance thing in the Q&A later on in this thing. If you have any questions during this, certainly type them into the Q&A, and we will try to get to those at the end. Without further ado, we will introduce our guest speaker today. It is Dr. Clark Palmerlow, who is a historian of U.S. gender and sexuality history at University of North Texas. He is an associate professor over there. He was also the major professor on my dissertation committee, so I have eternal fondness for Clark. He has a book called Califia Women, Feminist Education Against Sexism, Classism, and Racism. The first is his first book. He's also more pertinent to today, written a chapter on LGBTQ plus studies on an open source textbook that I will post a link to in our Q&A for anyone who wants to see that. Without further ado, I give you Clark Palmer.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I think I'm on now. There, I'm on. Good to be here. Thank you so much to Drs. Wisely and Northrup and to TCC for inviting me to talk on National Coming Out Day. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral territory of the Spokane tribe on also Indigenous Day. And I'm grateful for the Spokane people's generations of stewardship over this seized and occupied land. So my talk is Out and Outed for LGBT plus history. And my hope is that you can see a PowerPoint as well as a little box with me in it. In addition to my thanks, I'll lay out my kind of objectives for this talk. That our historical record for LGBTQ plus history is largely based on people coming out through what they've said about themselves and their desire, and based on others outing people by interpreting what they consider queer behavior in situations that often were coercive or oppressive to the individuals who are being deemed queer. As a historian, I'm going to take you through U.S. LGBTQ plus histories past from colonial times through the gay liberation calls to come out. And this history, of course, has implications for National Coming Out Day and also for how we consider each other and our forebearers. And I'll point out really quickly in this image, this is a much more recent image of the closet and advocacy for coming out. And I think it's interesting and relevant that the 2021 version really highlights safety, support, and love, and it being okay if people feel safer inside the closet. So there's evidence of gender and sexual diversity in pre-colonized Native societies. But we have to read most of the sources filtered through European biases. When Europeans encountered nearly 600 different indigenous nations, the ways these native societies constructed gender and allowed varied sexual practices challenged Europeans' essentialist beliefs. Europeans tended to believe that their Christian God had created two fixed genders through sex assignment, then set gender divided roles for people, and made reproduction the purpose of sex. For colonists, sex acts outside of reproduction were signs of sin, but they were not fixed identity. And I'll get back to that later. Colonial Europeans established norms of marital reproduction and also a sexual double standard within gender roles, which rendered everything that fell outside of marital reproduction or their notions of gender unacceptable. Yet, European and later American records give evidence that over 130 tribes recognized some individuals as women whom Europeans considered male, and or acknowledged some persons as men whom Europeans sexed female. It's clear that individuals in many indigenous societies could publicly show their gender identity that differed from what Europeans would have sexed them at birth. They showed this through gendered clothing, hairstyles, and the roles they took in their society. These people were often valued members of their society. Initially, Spanish conquerors couldn't distinguish these types of women from Spanish ideas about men in intimate relationships with other men. This image on the PowerPoint from 1594 is Theodore de Brye's engraving of Spaniards having their dogs attack a group of people whom the Spanish considered men engaged in sodomy, but whom the indigenous people considered women, who were full-fledged, respectable members of their society. So at first, the terms for such people came from Europeans. As late as 1770, on an expedition to California, Pedro Fages continued to conflate native cross-gendered people with sodomites. He observed what he thought were men, quote, in the dress, clothing, and character of women, there being 2 or 3 such in each village. They are called Hoyas and are held in great esteem, end quote. French colonizers called First Nations people who did not conform to Western gender and sexual norms, Berdache. Finally, in 1990, a tribal elder named Myra Laramie proposed the umbrella term Two-Spirit to get away from these pejorative European labels. Over the course of the 1600s through the 1800s, American colonists and then the US government were at war with Native people over land, resources, and the attempts to assimilate indigenous communities into Euro-American norms. Even as the federal government imposed a reservation system in the 1870s, Native people fought to continue their gender worldview. For example, when an official from the Bureau of Indian Affairs jailed a member of the Crow, who the Crow called a man-woman, the official cut off her hair, forced men's work on her, and the Crow community rebelled. Their chief told the agent to leave because he had violated their social order. This photograph on the right from about 1886 is of the famous Zuni Huiwa from New Mexico. And the photograph is part of recording notable Native people. So Huiwa was an excellent weaver and potter, and she was part of a delegation to Washington, D.C. that met with President Grover Cleveland about Native rights. The traditional Zuni culture called male-bodied people who took on social and ceremonial roles women performed, people like Huiwa, Ihamana. And I've put these terms in the PowerPoint. If they're in red, they're European terms. If they're in light green, they are terms to specific tribes, and then the overarching term, Two-Spirit. Now, the boarding school system that took Native children away from their families and culture That system was very effective in replacing traditional varieties of views on gender and sexuality with dominant societies' insistence on conservative gender roles and heterosexuality. Many Native people in the late 20th century and today have lost their own people's history of how their tribe made room for multiple genders. In each of my sections of this talk, I have a takeaway. So the takeaway in this section is that I think it's important for us today to understand that this term two-spirit and the indigenous people to whom it applies is not identical to the terms gay or lesbian or trans. For example, a Zuni term like Ihamana or the umbrella term like two-spirit exists in an indigenous matrix of Native social, cultural, and ceremonial roles that just doesn't reduce to conventional gender roles or transgender or genderqueer identities. Within colonial America, theology and society held that sexuality was behavior, not majority and minority identities. So that universalizing concept was the foundation for legal statutes that said acts like oral or anal sex were unnatural, were sins and crimes. But the law did not claim that violators had specific sexual orientations. Even so, we have some evidence of people who were hauled before court and described themselves based on their bodies and their desires. An English servant's case illustrates class-based community policing of gender and sex that outed an individual. Thomasine Hall lived as a girl, a woman, and then a man before migrating to Virginia in 1627 as a male indentured servant named Thomas Hall. There, Hall's sewing skills and Hall's sporadically dressing in women's clothing led neighbor women to question Hall's gender. They physically examined Hall 3 separate times, sometimes jumping Hall while Hall was asleep or forcibly holding Hall down. Colonial times gave employers access to an employee's body, especially an indentured servant or an enslaved person, and they just didn't have our sense of privacy or bodily autonomy. Amid the rumors that Hall had fornicated with a serving woman, the General Court assessed Hall's actions and gender in 1629. A witness testified that someone had asked Hall, "Why do you wear women's clothes?" And the witness heard Hall reply, quote, "I go in women's apparel to get a bit for my cat," end quote. That's slang, and scholars of colonial Virginia interpret this as speaking a desire for sex. The women examiners declared that Hall had male genitalia. So when asked whether the defendant was a man or a woman, the court recorded Hall's response as, quote, "He was both, only he had not the use of the man's part," the penis, and, quote, "I have a piece of an hole," end quote, where that likely means vulva. After the townswomen refused an official ruling that Hall was female like them, the next court decreed Hall must wear a combination of men's and women's clothing. And that's represented in this image from 2020, a rendering of Hall wearing men's breeches, pants, and jacket, but then the head covering and the apron that would be typical of a woman. Now, we are never going to know for sure whether Hall was intersex and or what to call Hall's sexual desire. Evidence suggests that, like other colonists, Hall enjoyed sex for pleasure outside of marriage. Even though that was considered a sin and like illegal, it was rampant in colonial Virginia. Anglo society was really more bothered by the fluidity, the moving back and forth between genders, than the hybridity, when they fixed Hall in place with this court ruling that they had to wear both clothing. So my takeaway here, almost 400 years after this court case, I'm struck by three things. The community women's sense of entitlement to decide who counts as a woman. Their underlying argument that they needed to exclude Hall for the safety of women. And then the court's prerogative to include, exclude, and mark people by gender. From the American Revolution through the Civil War, defining sex as acts rather than identity continued. New gender norms, however, affected attitudes towards same-gender attraction. Late 18th century Americans rejected a colonial view that women were particularly sexual. Colonial times thought women were kind of insatiable. And instead, in the late 1700s, society idealized a Protestant middle-class woman as passionless and very, very sexually self-controlled. And they positioned this against, compared to men supposedly having a natural sex drive. Women reformers, who started out organizing in churches, asserted that their society needed women's input based on women's particular Christian virtues. The perception that women and men's temperaments and desires were distinctly different facilitated wide acceptance of emotionally intense same-gender relationships that existed alongside traditional marriage. Contemporaries were more likely to attribute a sexual component to these so-called romantic friendships, like that of Walt Whitman and Peter Doyle pictured on your slide, than they did to women's relationships. Why? Society continued to believe a penis was necessary for sex. Occasionally, women who could support themselves lived together in what were called Boston marriages, so they became couples with their own household. Now, I want to use Walt Whitman and some of the suffragists as examples of romantic friendship because they clearly were attracted to their own gender, and as public figures, they had to negotiate how to express that. So with Whitman, and in your photograph of him, he's the seated figure with the large white beard. In 1859, Whitman was 40 years old, and he did not publish. He wrote 12 poems, which he titled Live Oak with Moss. He never published them as they were, but he reworked portions of them to put in the Calamus portion of his enormous poetry book called Leaves of Grass. Scholars found the 12 original poems in 1953, and they give us insight into a man who was trying to find words for himself and his same-sex desire a decade before the term homosexual or bisexual got created. So in looking for language to describe himself, he references ancient Greek friendship, and he uses the term adhesiveness for two men being drawn together. Live Oak with Moss tells a story of manly love, where it takes manly love as a given, something that's organic and natural and pure. And together, the original poem's story is of a man fantasizing about love with a future love or lovers. So in very brief summary, you might, quote, seek your lifelong lover, poem 1, one day, and think of little else, poem 2, the next. Love can be tender, poem 7, or fierce and terrible, poem 9, or both and more. The friend you love may lie sleeping by your side, poem 3, Or there may be, quote, other men in other lands, end quote, whom you wish to love, poem 4. Love may be public, like the, quote, 2 men I saw today on the pier, poem 6, or secret, a, quote, subtle electric fire that for your sake is burning within me, poem 10. In his unpublished poems, Whitman came out and said, quote, I am what I am, in poem 8. But when contemporaries specifically questioned Whitman about his proclivities, he was vague and defensive, likely because he knew that while society normalized male-male friendships, same-sex acts were still illegal, and they carried social stigma. So, for example, John Addington Symonds wanted Whitman to explain the sexuality of his less direct published poems. Instead, Whitman claimed, quote, I have had 6 children, 2 are dead, 1 living Southern grandchild, fine boy, who writes to me occasionally, end quote. Well, scholars haven't verified this claim to any children. They have unearthed another manuscript of a draft poem which is clearly stating encounters with men that Whitman then published after changing it to be an encounter with a woman. Unlike men, whose public affection could raise questions about their private acts, women in the 1800s and early 1900s had a lot more leeway to be publicly affectionate, kissing and hugging. And privately, diaries and letters by suffragists attest to romantic and also sexual experiences with other women. Among women in the movement to gain the vote, many leaders had relationships together. Susan B. Anthony, whom I have not pictured here because I've already got a cluttered screen, she wrote romantic letters to suffragist Anna Elizabeth Dickinson, and she had a long relationship with a woman named Emily Gross. Anthony wrote to a close friend that Gross was her lover. That's a term in the 19th century that could mean admirer, but not for Anthony. Carrie Chapman Catt was married twice to men, but also enjoyed a 30-year relationship with Molly Garrett Hay. Catt was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association through the 1920 passage of the vote. And Hay was president of the New York Equal Suffrage League, which got the vote for New York in 1918. They wrote love letters when Catt was away campaigning. They lived together once Catt was widowed. When Hay died, Catt made plans to be buried beside her rather than either husband or a family of origin. And I've put a picture of their tombstone here on the slide, which is a testimony to their relationship, even though it's not blatant. It reads, quote, here lie two united in friendship for 38 years through constant service to a great cause, end quote. Anna Howard Shaw, an earlier president of NAWSA, also had a 30-year relationship. Hers was with Lucy Anthony, the niece of Susan B. Anthony. Early on, Dr. Shaw had scandalized people by keeping her hair in a short bob, and the press had just skewered her as mannish. So she learned to perform the femininity required to be an effective public speaker. Anthony, Lucy Anthony, 14 years younger than Shaw, gushed in correspondence about how eager she was for them to move in together so she could create a happy home for Shaw and support Shaw's activism. Here on the slide, they're pictured together at home, where Shaw is in a chunkier chair, typical of the husband of a house, and Anthony is in the lighter wicker chair. This final picture of African-American suffrage field organizer Alice Dunbar Nelson is there because of her diary. Her diary represents a transitional period into the 20th century idea of lesbianism. Historian Wendy Roos noted that Dunbar Nelson's descriptions show us, quote, a thriving lesbian and bisexual subculture among Black suffragists and club women, end quote. The diary entries record romantic and sexual experiences Dunbar Nelson had with men, with women, while she was single, and while she was married. But in the 1920s, from then on, as Boston marriages were fading, society was increasingly pathologizing lesbian relationships. And scholars who are not interested in the history of sexuality have tended to minimize these very strong, intimate relationships between these suffragists. So my takeaway here, 19th century Americans expected that women would feel emotionally closer to other women and that men would be drawn to men's company. So you've got a wide range of that going on. Now, later LGBTQ people, like my generation and younger and a bit older, we have sometimes looked back on this time and really wanted to find our gay, lesbian, bi, pan, trans ancestors. And so in doing that, sometimes we make assumptions about what kind of sex were they having, or we fixate on that. And we're not going to know, usually. I think focusing on sex acts actually is really reductionistic, and it reduces the holistic complexity of these queer relationships. All right, so Vanguard communities formed in this same period that I'm talking about that suffrage was going on. Industrialization through the 1800s played a role in forming communities by sexual orientation. Same-sex relationships occurred among men doing physical labor in areas that had extreme gender imbalances. So men were having relationships, sometimes fleeting sex, sometimes strong, long, intense, complicated relationships like the romantic friendships. In the mining in California, Pacific Northwest logging, coastal dock work, railroad labor, these very gender imbalanced settings. And as industry spread, more people migrated to larger urban centers looking for work, factory jobs, other related work. Communities based on same-sex attraction formed. By the late 1800s, New York City had developed a subculture with identity terms like fairy, men who called themselves fairies, and they tended to be effeminate working class men, or men who called themselves queer, who were more gender normative men who loved men. New Orleans was another hub, and an array of women-women relationships existed, usually divided along class and racial lines. Lesbians sometimes patronized bars, dance halls, and other public spaces where queer men congregated in the early 1900s. This did not go unnoticed. Moral reformers really pushed the police from Los Angeles to New York to arrest queer people in public spaces like bars for quote-unquote depravity. Law enforcement might, for example, arrest women for wearing pants and having short hair on charges of masquerading as if they were, going to be mistaken for men. The image I have here is an 1892 advertisement from New York calling on police to raid a place called The Slide. And what I find really interesting about this, besides the language, is the picture at the top left corner. So I've made it a little bigger and drawn a lavender circle around the figure of the fairy. It depicts a fairy, and it signals that this man's a fairy by portraying him with one limp wrist and then the other hand waving a handkerchief at the other men. At the same time that community formation was occurring, where people were coming out to each other to signal interest, You had these self-proclaimed authorities arising who started using the language of medical science to develop the concepts of heterosexuality and homosexuality. Most of these men, who were called sexologists, argued that same-sex attraction correlated with gender transgression, and that these were pathological identities in the sense that sexologists usually claimed homosexuality was a mental illness. So the fairy and the butch became stereotypes to target people and identify them as supposedly homosexual. Although queer communities continued to spread, anti-vice campaigns also continued, and by the 1920s, they were punishing queer public expression. After Prohibition ended, federal and state officials enacted alcoholic beverage control laws to police respectability in bars. And this was wider than same-sex attraction. These state agents held the authority to revoke alcohol licenses if bar owners allowed the presence of sex workers, of gambling, or of gays and lesbians. Those were terms in popular culture by the 1920s, because all of those people were considered, quote, undesirables. According to the laws, they made these establishments disorderly. So from the 1930s through the 1960s, police freely busted bar patrons on suspicion of homosexuality. So my takeaway, one of the difficulties I find with this period is how to know why a person was being gender nonconforming. So the fairy, for example. By our standards, fairies looked like men. They wore men's clothing, but they might have some ways they signaled through brighter colors or by the way they held their body. And these acts, which were considered effeminate, did signal their desire. But I wonder, was that why they were doing that? Or was it that they also felt more comfortable with that gender expression? And I don't know. We also see society developing a stereotype that not conforming to gender norms meant that one was sexually queer. So during World War II, the military spread this normalizing of the concept of heterosexuality and the negative perception of homosexuality. Psychologists convinced military officials that homosexuality was a mental disorder that would threaten morale and discipline in the military. As 18 million men moved through draft boards and induction stations, staffers who didn't really have training to find queer people were told to look for certain things for a gender nonconformity, to ask questions. And so you got this patchwork of inconsistent questions designed to find and exclude gay men from service. Well, the questioning certainly must have heightened men's recognition that homosexuality existed as a concept, while also pathologizing it. Officials also feared that men would claim to be gay in order to avoid the draft during World War II. So they labeled those whom they rejected as homosexual, quote, sexual psychopath, as a deterrent. And they gave employers the right to review draft records so that this would then carry with the man whether or not that was his sexual orientation, and he wouldn't be hireable, he might not be able to find housing. It's interesting that during World War II, you see the first big serious attempt at women's auxiliary units for the military, and they didn't do this. Criminal law usually ignored lesbian sex acts, and that type of invisibility extended to policies for screening women recruits. They didn't ask. It wasn't proper to ask such a thing of a woman. So gay service members caught having sex, or even just suspected in systematic inquisitions, especially right as World War II was ending, they faced humiliating expulsion. And that left several thousand men and dozens of women with undesirable discharges, which are today being revoked. Gay and lesbian communities proliferated during and after the war. And ironically, it was especially in cities with a military presence and a lot of people coming and going. In the context of the Cold War, federal, state, and local authorities redoubled their efforts to regulate for a straight state. This included congressional laws and a presidential executive order against employing homosexual people in federal jobs. Recent scholars have argued that the 1950s McCarthy Red Scare, which was purportedly about anti-communism, really victimized gay men and lesbians a lot. And in this photograph, we see George Harris, the shorter man, and he's an example of the thousands of people fired and not hired based on these exclusions from federal jobs. When the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, did a background check for his job there, they asked people in his Mississippi hometown about his sexual orientation and then fired him. Suddenly jobless and homeless based on the testimony of these hometown people, Harris got a ride to Texas from DC. And there he met Jack Evans soon afterward at a Dallas gay bar. As they dated, they tended to steer clear of the bars to avoid arrest. They lived together, and 59 years after they met, they became the first gay couple to marry legally in Dallas County. So this image is them with George holding up the marriage license. In the face of Cold War hostility and McCarthyism, LGBTQ communities further institutionalized and began organizing for civil rights. The homophile movement started in Los Angeles with gay men forming the Mattachine Society in 1951. And those three main founders, Harry Hay, Bob Hull, and Chuck Rowland, already had organizing experience because they had been part of the United States Communist Party. One of them was also a veteran of the military. So they organized their homophile group into secret cells to prevent and survive government infiltration. The founders blended Marxist theory with the inspiring actions of the African American civil rights movement. In the Marxist theory part, they thought about injustice and oppression as something that's deeply embedded in social structures. And they argued that the repressive norms based on heterosexuality left homosexual people, quote, largely unaware that they in fact constituted a social minority imprisoned within a dominant culture, end quote. So here in the 1950s, we've got this definite sense of identity labels and hiding, and therefore the possibility of coming out rather than hiding. Founders sought to mobilize a large gay constituency through meetings, and they created homophile journals that produced, quote, a new pride, a pride in belonging, a pride in participating in the cultural growth and the social achievement of the homosexual minority. So I love that quotation from the 1950s, that this idea of pride and being a minority group is already fully developed before Stonewall. So soon Mattachine grew to include a lot of people who were way more politically mainstream than the founders and who were anti-communist and were really uncomfortable with the communist backgrounds of those founders. So the founders stepped down in favor of new leadership. The Neuter Leadership argued that the members, who were mostly white and middle class, were just the same as heterosexual citizens, aside from this private sphere of love. And these new leaders focused on gaining allies among heterosexual psychologists and clergymen and public officials. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons, their group, Daughters of Bilitis, was also fighting the church, the psychoanalytic couch, and the courts for equality. Like the more male-run Mattachine Review or One magazine, Daughters of Bilitis had a journal called The Ladder, and that journal consistently assured lesbians of their worth as respectable middle-class people deserving equal treatment to heterosexuals. Chapters of both organizations spread to the East Coast and the Midwest, to Texas, and formed a web of advocates for homosexual civil rights by the mid-1960s. So they were publishing. By the mid-60s, they were lobbying and even had small groups picketing the White House and city governments, all asking for equality. And by the 60s, the Black civil rights legal work and Black civil rights direct action had produced court-ordered desegregation, had produced anti-discrimination laws, the Voting Rights Act. But none of that overturned centuries of de facto housing segregation or educational and job discrimination that really racialized poverty. So frustrations were rising in poor communities of color, especially over police brutality and lack of economic opportunities. And here we see some of the intersections among people from poverty and people of color and queer and trans people. In 1965, in San Francisco, there were gay and lesbian street youth who started organizing. And they came together with trans women, many of whom were women of color. They had been finding a particular cafeteria called Compton's Cafeteria, one of the few places they could meet and relax. And so when the management of Compton's Cafeteria called the police on them to try to deter the presence of drag queens and trans women, the patrons resisted and a riot started. And the next night, trans hustlers and street people picketed against Compton's and picketed the police brutality. Now, these protests did not end abuse. That's still going on. But the collective militant queer resistance really pushed the city of San Francisco to have to try to address their rights as citizens. So my takeaway here is that the sustained activism after World War II really started both gaining allies and further consolidated communities of people who felt like they had to be out in order to gain rights. My last section is on gay liberation, because that's where we get the kind of official call to come out. Gay liberation in the 1970s really gives us our modern concept and this advice to come out. 3 years after the Compton's Cafeteria riot and the Stonewall Inn riot broke out in New York City due to a police raid. Stonewall Inn was a mafia-run dive that really capitalized on the closet. The bar owners blackmailed gay Wall Street patrons and used those funds to pay off the police. And then in turn, the police would give Stonewall advance warning before raiding. Raids tended to target and out those whom they caught. So that's why gay Wall Street patrons, didn't want to get caught and have their names put in the newspapers outing them as gay. But in addition, raids often targeted people who were gender nonconforming, like drag queens, and trans sex workers, like Sylvia Rivera. It could ruin the lives of white, Black, Latino, gay, and lesbian customers. Newspaper exposure led to those who had been arrested being fired or evicted from rental housing. And on June 28, 1969, there was no warning before the raid. But on that night, trans and lesbian patrons especially resisted. They refused to produce identification or to follow the female officer into the bathroom to verify their genitalia for how they would be arrested. They also objected to officers groping them in a sexualized manner. A growing crowd outside spontaneously responded to the police violence by hurling coins and cans at the officers, and the officers then retreated into the bar. The rioting resumed a second night, a third night. The gay poet Allen Ginsberg, who was in New York City, heard slogans and came by and crowed, quote, "Gay power, isn't it great? We're one of the largest minorities in the country. 10%, you know? It's about time we did something to assert ourselves," end quote. Well, the Stonewall riot itself didn't stop police raids or police violence, but mainstream and gay coverage and leafleting spurred the creation of a new militant gay organizing beyond the homophile groups that already existed. The Gay Liberation Front, for example, sought to combine freedom from homophobia with a broader political platform that denounced racism and also opposed capitalism. The Gay Activists Alliance rose from the Gay Liberation Front with a format of zaps where they would show up where a politician was in public and surprise them and force them to acknowledge gay and lesbian rights. Gay liberationists like Carl Whitman, no relation to the poet I talked about, drew on the New Left, anti-war student activism, and the women's liberation movement that was going on at the same time. Carl Whitman's Refugees from America, a Gay Manifesto from 1970 rails against external and internalized homophobia. He said that gay men must discard male chauvinism as actually anti-gay too. That rather than mimic a straight society, gay liberation should reject gender roles and marriage and embrace queens as having gustily stood out and stood up when others were afraid. Whitman was attuned to this rise of lesbian feminism, which tied sexism together with homophobia. Lesbian feminists emphasized their focus on women's autonomy and well-being rather than identification as mothers, wives, and daughters who indirectly gained from what benefited men. Carl Whitman implored gays to free themselves by coming out, but he also acknowledged that that would be too dangerous for some people yet. The gay liberation movement continued slowly to move the general public toward toleration and then acceptance. They gained support from some Christian and Jewish denominations. They forced the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its lists of mental disorders, and they pushed for political change. By the end of the 1970s, activists had decriminalized themselves in just under half the nation because they had overturned 22 state sodomy statutes. They had countered anti-gay city initiatives and had convinced the Democratic Party to include a plank against sexual orientation-based discrimination in its 1980 platform. They'd have to wait until 2003 for the Supreme Court decision on Lawrence versus Texas to strike down sodomy laws nationwide, and even longer for marriage equality. The 1970s saw a cultural renaissance of LGBT institution building and cultural productions. More Americans came out, despite the real hazards of family rejection, violence, and legal discrimination. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, whom I've pictured here, survived such dangers and started an organization called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR. They started in 1970, and STAR was the first trans women of color led organization. It created the first shelters for homeless queer youth and sex workers in all of North America. By recognizing links among homophobia, transphobia, racism, and classism, STAR filled needs that other early gay liberation groups weren't considering. More often, gay and lesbians organized safe space through bars, gay bathhouses, bookstores, discos where they listened to music and danced, sports leagues, and musical ensembles. As the 1970s continued, lesbian feminists of color took the lead on how crucial was what they called the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. The rise of a distinctly political nationalist Christian right and the ways that AIDS first hit gay communities in the US slowed progress, but this was still kind of the basis for where we come to today, both on coming out and rights. So my final takeaway is that the 1970s are far from the end of the story, but they are the beginning of this united call to come out as a way that individuals can have authentic, fulfilling lives and contribute to progress in the rights and opportunities LGBTQ plus people have. So what do you think? Do you think, what do you think are the pros and cons of coming out as a tactic for personal and societal gain? As I said before, thank you so much for inviting me. I think that concludes my talk, and I believe we have a question and answer session, so I'll turn it back over to our organizers for that.
Thank you, Dr. Pomerleau.
Sure.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Dr. Pomerleau. We are short on time. I understand this is going to stop in about 5 minutes, but I just want to sum up by saying that if you are thinking about coming out, if you want more information, I would direct you towards the Resource Center in Dallas, and they have a lot of youth programs that will offer you support in whatever your decision is about that. And it is a very personal decision for you to make. Sometimes it isn't the right time to come out, and where we wish that we lived in a world where it was not even a question, that we could be our authentic selves all the time. That isn't where we do live. And so, you know, make sure that you think about it before making that leap. I'm sure it hasn't been easy for all of us. Just as a question, I would ask you, and this is something I'm going to presume that a lot of these people are in my class, that how do you feel about using the labels on people without having any kind of information about it and in their lives exactly?
Well, that's what I'm calling the outing, right? And so I'm opposed to outing as a general practice because we live in a society that's still oppressive, and you can't know the situation someone else is in. In terms of World War II, you had this supposed outing of at least hundreds of men who were not actually sexual minorities. They were cisgender heterosexual men, and they were being falsely accused. But whether it's a false accusation or whether there's some evidence, it's something that has a lot of potential to be damaging for the individual.
Yeah, it's yeah. There we go. Yeah, it's there's a lag between going live on me and you. I would just say that you know, if the information that you're looking for as a person in the 21st century is, were there LGBT people in the past, the answer is yeah. They had different ways of talking about it, different names that they called it, but there have always been same-sex and oriented people in our history, from, you know, way back, and so maybe don't concentrate so much on labels. And again, if any of you have any kind of questions, certainly I'm available here on campus at TCC, and if the question is for Dr. Pomerleau, I can certainly relay those to him. So thank you again for coming, and you know, we are still in a learning process, and every time we do one of these things, maybe I'll learn how to do it better. So as far as like timing and adding more time at the end for questions. So thank you, Dr. Pomerleau, for everything, and thank everybody here for attending. So
thank you, everyone.
It's due